The whole ballroom laughed at the Duke's wife for being dull, clumsy, and dressed in the plainest gown of the night. She stood there in silence, eyes lowered, taking every cruel whisper. What none of them knew, beneath that quiet duchess hid a war commander the country had mourned as dead for 9 years. And the night was about to remind them. They say the Duke regrets it now. 2 years married and not a single charming word from her. Clara, Duchess of Ashworth, heard every syllable. The drawing-room door had been left a finger's width open, and voices carried as cleanly through that gap as smoke through a cracked chimney. She did not turn her head. She did not even blink. "Stand still, Your Grace," murmured Madame Beauvais, the French modiste who had been summoned from Bond Street that very morning. "3 more pins, and the lavender shall sit just so." Clara stood still. She had stood still in places far less pleasant than a sunlit drawing-room in Mayfair, with worse promises pressed against her than a row of dressmakers' pins. None of the 3 young ladies giggling in the hallway would ever guess as much. That was the point. Outside, the great house at Berkeley Square hummed like a hive on the eve of swarm. It was Tuesday morning, and the Royal Regency Ball was but 4 days away. Footmen carried silver across the marble floor of the entrance hall. The under-butler shouted orders down to the kitchens. A boy from the chandler's waited at the back gate with a fresh consignment of beeswax tapers, and somewhere above stairs, a maid was beating dust from the heavy damask curtains that had not been touched since Christmastide. In the center of it all, Clara stood upon a low wooden footstool, her arms held lightly out from her body, while a gown of muted lavender silk was pinned about her ribs. The color had been the Dowager Duchess's choosing, a safe hue the old woman had called it, suitable for a young wife of no particular brilliance who must not draw the eye away from her betters. Clara had accepted the choice without argument. Lavender was a fine color to disappear in. The whispers from the hall drifted on. "I heard she trod upon Lady Pembroke's slipper at the Cavendish supper, twice in 1 quadrille. It is the clumsy gait, one can see it across a ballroom. And no poetic word in her, my dear. The Duke recites Byron, and she stares at the fire as though waiting for it to speak in her stead. A dull weight about his neck, that is what my brother calls her, a millstone in silk." Madame Beauvais coughed loudly and rattled her tin of pins, hoping perhaps to mask the words. Clara gave the Frenchwoman the smallest smile she could muster, to show her that the kindness was noted, though not needed. Years of harder things had built in her a stillness that no parlor cruelty could now disturb. She let her gaze travel about the room, as it always did, as it always had. 2 doors, 1 window of consequence, 8 feet to the flagstones below if a person were obliged to drop. A pair of iron candlesticks upon the mantel, weighted enough to fell a man if swung properly. The bell pull at her left shoulder, the fire screen at her right. A china shepherdess upon the side table, small and breakable, of no use to anyone with sense. She did this without thought, the way another lady might count the buttons upon a glove. It was a habit gathered in a life she no longer spoke of, and it would not be put down. The voices in the hall had grown bolder. "Do you suppose he shall dance with her at all on Saturday?" "He must, surely, for the first set. After that, I should not wager a shilling." A sharp footfall sounded upon the parquet. The whispers stopped at once, as though a candle had been snuffed beneath a glass. The drawing-room door opened in full. Valerius, Duke of Ashworth, stood in the frame. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulder, with dark hair cut to a clean line above the collar of his morning coat. His features were of the sort that the gossip sheets called stern but well-favored, and at present they were entirely unreadable. He carried his riding gloves in one hand, the leather of them creased from a hard grip. He had heard. Clara saw it at once. The set of his jaw told her so, and the slight whitening of the knuckles upon the gloves. He did not look toward the hall. He did not call out a rebuke, nor summon the offending young ladies, nor send for their chaperones. He simply crossed the carpet to the footstool where his wife stood pinned in lavender silk, and he placed one gloved hand very lightly upon the curve of her shoulder.
The pressure of it was no more than the weight of a folded newspaper, yet Clara felt it through every layer of muslin and stay and skin. He held the touch a long moment. Then he turned his head, just so, and met her eyes. "You are quite handsome in that color," he said, in a voice pitched to carry the length of the room and the hall beyond. "Madame, I trust the gown shall be finished by Friday?" "It shall, your grace," said the modiste, fairly trembling with the joy of his approval. "Very good." The Duke pressed his wife's shoulder once more in the smallest squeeze and released her. "I shall be in the library when you are at leisure, my dear. There is a matter upon which I should value your ear." He bowed and was gone, his boot heels striking a quiet rhythm down the corridor. The whispers in the hall did not resume. Clara stood very still upon her footstool, lavender silk pinned about her, and felt the place upon her shoulder where his glove had rested. There were a great many things her husband did not know about her. She had told herself, on the day she had agreed to marry him, that he need never know them, and that she would carry the silence of it as quietly as she carried everything else. But the Duke had a matter on which he wished her ear. Clara, who had not been called by any name but Duchess for 2 years, felt the first small stirring of something she had thought long buried. It felt remarkably like a soldier coming to attention. The library at Berkeley Square smelled of old leather and the small fire that burned in the grate even in mid-spring, for the Duke had never cared for a cold room. Valerius stood at the window when his wife entered, a letter folded once between his fingers. He did not turn at the sound of the door. "Sit, if you please." Clara sat. The lavender silk had been put away upstairs, and she now wore a plain morning gown of fawn muslin that did nothing to flatter her, which was the precise reason she had chosen it. She arranged her hands in her lap as a duchess ought, and waited. Valerius came to the chair opposite. He laid the letter upon the small marquetry table between them, but did not invite her to read it. His face had returned to the careful, unreadable thing it usually was, save for a furrow at the bridge of his nose. "I dine at White's this evening," he said. "I shall not be home until late. Cook has been told." "I shall manage, your grace." He looked at her then, properly, as though searching for something he had not thought to look for before. The drawing-room moment, with his glove upon her shoulder, sat between them like a third party in the room. Clara. He had not used her Christian name in some weeks. "If anything were to come to this house in my absence, any caller of an unusual sort, any letter pressed upon a footman, any matter that struck you as out of its place, you would send word to me at the club, at once, yes?" "Yes." He waited, perhaps for a question. She did not give him one. He nodded once, slowly, and rose to ring for his hat. White's at 4 in the afternoon was at its emptiest, which was why Valerius had chosen the hour. The morning men had gone home to dress for dinner, and the evening men had not yet arrived to gamble away their estates. He found the small reading room above the staircase quite empty, save for one gentleman, who sat in a wing-backed chair with his back to the door and a folded copy of the Morning Post upon his knee. "You took your time, Ashworth. My household is preparing for Saturday. A duke cannot leave by the front door without 3 footmen pursuing him with messages." Valerius shut the door and turned the small brass key. The gentleman in the chair stood. He was perhaps 50, grey at the temples, with the upright carriage of a man who had spent 20 years in regimentals before being put behind a desk at the War Office. His name was Colonel Hartwell, and he had taught Valerius's elder brother to ride in another life. "Sit, sit. I have not the time for ceremony, and nor have you." Hartwell drew a thin packet of papers from inside his coat and laid them on the small table. "The matter has worsened since I wrote, considerably." Valerius took the chair opposite and unfolded the topmost sheet. "The Viper's Nest," Hartwell said. "We have at last a name for them, if a poor one. A small cell of disgruntled men,
Half of them are former officers, broken on half pay, denied their pensions, sent home from Spain and Portugal to find their farms enclosed and their wives ruined. The other half are radicals of the new sort, pamphleteers, lawyers without briefs, the usual hangers-on. The combination is what makes them dangerous. How many? 40, perhaps. We are certain of 19 names. The rest are shadows. Valerius read the second sheet. It was a list of intercepted correspondence, dates, and initials. He had been a magistrate long enough to read between the lines of such things. And their object? The ball on Saturday. He looked up.
Hartwell met his eye without flinching. We have it from 2 separate informers. They mean to bar the doors during the supper interval, take the king's delegates as hostages, and force a signature upon a treaty of their own drafting. A grievance document dressed up as a constitution. They believe the Ton will sign anything with a saber at its throat, and they may be right. Within the palace itself. Within the palace itself. Valerius set the sheet down with care. His hand was perfectly steady, which surprised him a little. And my household? You said in your note that I should take particular care. Your name is upon a list, Ashworth. You and 3 other peers known to vote with the crown. They will move first against the men they wish to silence at the table. Your wife is to attend? She is. The colonel was silent a moment. He had known Valerius since the boy was 12, and he chose his next words gently. Then I would urge you to consider leaving her at Berkeley Square. A headache, a fever, any small fiction will serve. Valerius did not answer at once. He was thinking, oddly, of a footstool in a drawing room and a row of pins in lavender silk and a small squeeze of his own gloved hand upon a quiet shoulder. I shall consider it. Hartwell gathered up the papers. Do more than consider. I lost my own wife to a chance ball at Badajoz, in the storming. I do not recommend the lesson. He moved to the door, then paused at the mantelpiece, where a portrait in oils hung above the candle sconces. The painting was a small one, half-length, of a young officer in the dark green of a rifle regiment, the face turned in 3/4 profile. A brass plate beneath read simply, Commander A. Thorne, Talavera, 1809. How I missed that one, Hartwell said quietly. If Thorne was still above ground, Ashworth, I should sleep tonight. A whole nest of vipers would not stand a quarter of an hour against that mind. What became of the commander? I have heard a dozen stories. None of them true, in my opinion. Vanished on the road home from Lisbon. Body never found. The regiment held a memorial without a coffin. Hartwell touched the frame, very briefly, and turned away. A waste, Ashworth. A great and shameful waste. He let himself out. Valerius sat alone for some minutes, watching the small fire, the portrait of Commander Thorne at his shoulder. He thought of Clara, and of the careful, blank way she had said, I shall manage, Your Grace. He had not the smallest notion how to keep her safe. The Ashworth travelling carriage left Berkeley Square at 9:30 on Thursday morning, with a second coach behind for the trunks, and a third for the upper servants. The road to Windsor was a fair day's drive in good weather, and the weather, by some small mercy, was holding. Clara sat with her back to the horses, as a duchess ought when travelling with her husband. Valerius had taken the forward seat, his long legs angled to one side. Between them lay a rug of Scottish wool, a flask of weak tea, and a silence that had been growing thicker since Brentford. He had not told her about Hartwell. He had told her only that the ball would be a heavy affair, and that she ought to take a long sleep at the coaching inn at Hounslow, where they would change horses near noon. Clara had agreed. She had also noticed, without remarking upon it, that her husband now carried a small pistol in the inner pocket of his greatcoat, a thing he had never done in 2 years of marriage. The carriage rattled westward, past hedgerows starred with hawthorn blossom and the low stone walls of small farms. A magpie skimmed across the road at Cranford. Clara watched it go, and thought of a hillside above Talavera, where she had once seen 7 of them rise from a hawthorn at the same hour of morning, the day before the battle. 7 for a secret never to be told. You are quiet, said Valerius. I find a carriage encourages it, Your Grace.
He looked at her a moment, then turned to his window again. They were perhaps 4 miles past Slough, on a lonely stretch of road where the hedges grew close and the trees met overhead, when the offside rear wheel struck a deep rut at speed. The sound was sharp and wrong, a crack like a dry stick under a boot, and the carriage lurched at once to a sickening angle. A trunk slid across the roof above. The offside horse screamed. The coachman, Hobbs, was shouting from the box. The footman leapt down from the second carriage. The third coach drew up some 20 yards behind in a confusion of dust. Valerius caught at the strap to steady himself. By the time he had thrown open the door, his wife was no longer in the carriage. He had not seen her move. One moment she had been at his elbow with her gloved hands in her lap, and the next she was out upon the verge, already crouched at the broken wheel with her skirts gathered into one fist. "Hobbs!" The coachman, white about the mouth, scrambled down from the box. "Your Grace, I beg pardon, the rut took us at a—" "The rut is not the question." Clara had not raised her voice, but the tone of it stopped the man mid-sentence. "Send Tom to the lead pair and walk them out of the traces. Do it now. If they pull, the axle will go through, and you shall have a dead horse for your trouble." Hobbs stared at her. "At once," she said. He went. Clara had laid her hand flat against the underside of the axle, feeling along the grain of the wood. Valerius, standing at the carriage door, saw what she was doing without understanding it. Her fingers ran the length of the timber as a man might run his over the barrel of a musket, looking for the fault. "The wheel is not the trouble," she said, half to herself. "The wheel is sound. The linchpin has sheared. Look here, Your Grace. The iron has split clean across, not bent. That is not the work of a rut." She held up the broken pin between 2 fingers. The break was bright and new at its edges. "It would have failed in the next mile, or the mile after. The rut only hurried it." Valerius came down from the carriage. "You are saying the pin was tampered with?" "I am saying iron does not break cleanly across its grain unless it has been weakened by a file, or struck very hard at a particular angle, or both." She turned the pin in the light. "I should wager a file. The cut is too neat." Her eyes lifted to the trees on either side of the road. They moved along the hedgerow, paused at a gap, moved on. Valerius, watching her face, saw a thing he had never seen there before. A still, narrow attention, of the kind a hawk wears upon a fence post. Then she caught herself. The change was so quick that a man less observant would have missed it altogether. Her shoulders softened. Her chin dropped a half-inch. The hand that held the broken pin became suddenly uncertain of how to hold it, and the fingers fumbled, and the pin fell into the dust at her feet. "Oh," she said. "Forgive me, I had not meant to— that is, I—" She picked up the pin and offered it to her husband with both hands, as though it were too heavy for one. "My father had a tenant once," she said, looking at the dust upon her glove. "A blacksmith at Wickham. He used to let me sit on a stool by his forge when I was a girl, while my governess took her tea at the parsonage. I suppose one picks up the look of things. Forgive my forwardness, Your Grace. I did not mean to give an order to Hobbs." Valerius took the pin. He looked at it, and then at his wife, and then at the trees beyond the verge where her gaze had paused so briefly. "Forwardness," he said slowly. "Yes, most unbecoming. I shall sit in the carriage, if you wish, while the men attend to it." "I do not wish that." She glanced up. There was something in his eye she did not care for, because it was the beginning of a question, and she had spent a long time arranging her life so that he should never have cause to ask one. Hobbs came back at that moment with the linchpin from the second carriage, and the small business of unhitching and refitting filled the next quarter of an hour with honest noise. Clara stood beside the milestone with her hands folded, the picture of a duchess slightly distressed by the inconvenience of country roads, and gave no further orders to anyone. But when they climbed back into the carriage, Valerius did not take the forward seat. He sat beside his wife, on her side of the rug, and rode the remainder of the way to Windsor in a silence of his own. The broken linchpin traveled with them, wrapped in his handkerchief, in the inner pocket of his greatcoat. They came to Windsor by the long avenue at the close of the afternoon on Friday, when the sun had dropped behind the high beeches and the gravel of the carriage sweep was the color of old pewter. The palace stood above them, its windows lit one by one as the link boys went their rounds with tapers, until the great west front seemed to float upon the dusk like a ship of glass. Clara had slept poorly at the coaching inn. Valerius had slept not at all. He had spent the small hours at the inn's writing desk, with the broken linchpin set upon a sheet of foolscap before him, and he had drafted 3 letters in 3 different hands. 2 had gone out by post-rider before dawn. The 3rd he carried still in the inside of his coat, alongside the pistol. He handed his wife down from the carriage at the courtyard with the same correct gentleness he had used at their wedding. Footmen in royal livery were at every doorway, and behind them, half a pace into the shadow, stood other men whose coats hung a little too straight at the hip. Valerius noticed. He wondered, with a queer pang, whether Clara did. She did. She had counted 4 of them between the carriage step and the threshold, and noted that none stood within arm's reach of another. Whoever had placed them knew his trade. She gave no sign of it. She gathered her traveling pelisse against the evening chill and walked at her husband's elbow into the lamplight. The crimson drawing-room had been opened for the reception of arriving guests, and it was already a sea of feathers and gauze and bared shoulders. Empire waist gowns moved across the parquet like pale boats. Old men in court dress stood in clusters near the fire, holding their snuff-boxes and their grievances close. The orchestra was tuning in the gallery, the long, mournful notes of the viols sliding under the talk like a hand under a curtain. Clara had been put into a gown of pale primrose silk for the evening, with a single string of seed pearls and gloves to the elbow. The skirt was heavy, with a deep band of embroidered laurel at the hem, and the laurel kept catching upon her heel as she walked. She managed it without stumbling, but only just, and the small hitches of her step did not escape the watching eyes of the room. A young woman in Pomona green leaned to her companion behind a fan. "There she is, the Duchess Lamentable." "Hush, you wicked thing." "I shall not hush. Look at her. She walks as though the floor were a ploughed field." Clara walked on. She had endured worse in places where the floor had indeed been a ploughed field. The Queen received in the inner room. She was a small woman with very sharp eyes and very white hair, and she greeted the Duke with the warmth of an old friendship, and her Duchess with the cool civility of duty. "Ashworth, we are glad of you. Your Majesty." "And the young Duchess?" The Queen extended her hand. Clara curtsied deeply, and made the curtsy a little stiff as she had practiced. "My dear, you have been long at Berkeley Square. You should come to court more often. A young woman wants the polish of company." "Your Majesty is very kind." "It is not kindness, child. It is observation. You walk as though you bore a yoke. There are several of the younger ladies who have the prettiest deportment this season, Lady Augusta in particular. You might do worse than to take a turn with her in the long gallery tomorrow and observe how she carries her head. A duchess sets a tone, you know. Half of England copies her." A few of the ladies-in-waiting permitted themselves the smallest of smiles. Clara bent her head a degree further. "I shall do my best to learn from her, Your Majesty." The Queen, who had expected at least a flicker of resentment, found herself faintly disappointed, and waved them on. Valerius's jaw was set so hard as he led his wife away that a vein stood at his temple. Clara, at his side, was the picture of a woman quietly crushed. In truth, she had heard perhaps 1 word in 5. Her eyes had been at work from the moment she crossed the threshold. They moved now along the cornice of the great ballroom that opened beyond the inner doors, a long room, perhaps 120 feet by 60, with a musician's gallery at the east end and 3 sets of double doors along the north wall giving onto the terrace. 2 service doors at the west, concealed in the panelling, a small door behind the gallery itself, half hidden by the drape.
4 chandeliers, each upon a chain that ran up to the ceiling, rose and down through the floor above to a counterweight room, where a single man could lower the hole into the room in under a minute if the wax began to drip. The windows were tall, sashed, and bolted from the inside. 3 of the bolts on the north side were already drawn. She marked them. The orchestra gallery had a stair at its rear that descended to a service corridor running the length of the building. The corridor met the kitchens at one end and the stables at the other. A woman moving with purpose could be in the stable yard inside 3 minutes if she knew the door behind the gallery, and 4.5 if she had a child by the hand. She marked that, too. A footman passed with a tray of Canary wine. Clara took a glass and held it without drinking. Beside her, Valerius was being greeted by Lord Pembroke, and managed to answer in whole sentences only by some effort of will.
"Your wife is quiet tonight, Ashworth. She has had a long journey, Pembroke. A great pity. The Queen had hoped to draw her out, I think." Pembroke's gaze rested upon Clara with a kindly pity that was almost worse than the laughter. "She is a sweet creature." "She is." Pembroke moved on. Valerius drew his wife a little closer to his side. "Are you well?" he murmured. "Quite well, Your Grace." She was watching the 3rd chandelier. The chain had a half-twist in it, the kind that would catch on the counterweight if a man tried to drop it in a hurry. She would have to remember to mention that. To someone. At some point. Saturday came in upon Windsor with a thin, grey rain that cleared by noon and left the garden smelling of wet box and turned earth. By 8 in the evening, the rain was a memory, and the great ballroom was a furnace of candles. 1,200 tapers burned in the 4 chandeliers, and as many again in the wall sconces, and the heat of them rose to meet the heat of 700 bodies in silk and superfine, until the upper panes of the windows fogged like a public house in winter. Clara had been placed in a gown of dove grey, shot with silver thread. It was the dullest gown in the room. She had chosen it herself, against the protests of her dresser. The skirt was full but not heavy, and the bodice had been cut a touch loose at the ribs, though no one looking at her would have noticed. She had given particular instructions about the underskirt. The quadrille had been called at 9:30. Valerius had led her out for the first set, as a duke must, and she had got through it without disgracing him by holding very tightly to the figure of the dance and counting the bars under her breath. He had bowed her back to her chair near the north wall and bent low to her ear before he left her. "Stay here. Do not move from this chair. I shall return within the half-hour." "Your Grace, promise me, Clara." She had given him a small, obedient nod, the kind a wife gives a husband when she means to do as she pleases the moment his back is turned. He had not yet learned to read it. He went. She watched him cross the floor to where the Duke of Wellington stood with a clutch of older men near the dais. She watched Colonel Hartwell, whom she did not know by sight but had marked at once for what he was, draw Valerius aside. She watched her husband's face change as Hartwell spoke into his ear, and she saw the moment a folded sheet of paper passed between them. She also saw, in the same quarter minute, the 4 service doors along the west wall close one after another, very quietly, from the inside. She set down her glass. The orchestra struck up a Sir Roger de Coverley. Couples flowed onto the floor with cries of delight, for the Sir Roger was a romping country dance, and the company had grown restive under so much politeness. Lady Pembroke seized Lord Allerton by the wrist and pulled him laughing into the line. Under the cover of the music, Clara heard the bar drop into its iron cradle across the great oak doors at the south end of the room. It was a small sound, a wooden thud, no louder than a book falling from a shelf. In a room of 700 laughing dancers, only 3 people in the ballroom heard it. Clara was one. Hartwell was another. Valerius, with the folded paper still in his hand, was the third. His head came round at once. He found his wife's chair against the north wall. The chair was empty. There were 11 of them. Clara counted as they came out from behind the curtains and from the service doors and from the door at the rear of the orchestra gallery. 11 men in the dark blue of palace guards, with the right facings and the right buttons, and with sabres at their belts, that were of the wrong pattern altogether. The sabres were cavalry issue, heavy at the tip, made for cutting from horseback. No palace guard had ever drawn such a blade indoors. The leader stepped onto the dais. He was a wiry man of 40, grey at the temple, with the upright set of a former officer and the white knuckles of one who had not slept in 3 nights. "Ladies and gentlemen," the Sir Roger collapsed mid-figure. A glass dropped somewhere and shattered on the parquet. A young woman in cherry pink began to scream and was hushed by her mother with a hand across the mouth.
You will remain calm. You will remain where you stand. No harm is meant to any person in this room, provided you keep your places. We have business with His Majesty's delegates, and with that business done, you shall have your ball back. My word upon it as a gentleman." A murmur ran through the room like wind through dry barley. The leader's eye fell on Wellington and on Valerius beside him. He raised one hand. 2 of his men moved at once across the floor, sabers low, and took stations at either side of the Duke. A third stepped behind Wellington. "His Grace of Ashworth, if you please, will surrender his small piece. We know you carry one tonight." Valerius's hand moved a fraction toward his coat and stilled. "Slowly, Your Grace, with 2 fingers." He drew the pistol out and laid it upon the carpet at his feet. "Kick it." He kicked it. The pistol slid across the floor and was caught beneath a boot. "Thank you. Now, His Majesty's Chief Secretary, Lord Bellingham, to the dais, if you please. We have a paper that wants a signature, and a king who shall be obliged to provide it when he hears how his court is held." Lord Bellingham, a fat man of 60, had gone the colour of tallow. He took 1 step toward the dais, and then a second. In the far north corner of the room, behind the great pillar that supported the 3rd chandelier, a dove-grey skirt had been laid down upon the parquet in a neat, soft heap, as though a duchess had stepped out of it and gone elsewhere. No one saw the skirt. They were all watching the dais. A long suit of polished armour stood in the alcove between the 2nd and 3rd windows of the north wall. A 16th-century harness, complete with its decorative halberd, set upright in an iron ring beside the gauntlet. The halberd was 8 feet long, with a head of blued steel and a haft of polished ash, and it had not been moved from its ring in 40 years. It moved now. She had hidden the trousers beneath her petticoats since dressing at 6. They were of stout buff cloth, cut close at the thigh and tapered to the calf, of the kind a cavalry officer wore beneath his overalls on a long march. She had kept them folded these 8 years in a locked trunk at the back of her dressing room at Berkeley Square, beneath a stack of woolen shawls that no maid would think to disturb. They smelled faintly of cedar and of an older life. The dove-grey overskirt had been fastened at the waist with 3 hooks of her own design, each set to give under a sharp downward tug. She had pulled them in sequence, 1, 2, 3, behind the pillar, and the skirt had dropped about her ankles in a single, soft fall. She had stepped clear of it in her riding boots, which she had also been wearing all evening, and which no one had thought to look at beneath the heavy hem. The bodice she left as it was. The looseness she had asked for at the ribs gave her shoulders the play they needed. She lifted the halberd from its ring with both hands. The weight of it was very familiar. She had not held a polearm in 9 years, but the body remembers what the mind has agreed to forget, and her grip found its old places upon the ash haft without thought. She set the head to the floor and walked out from behind the pillar. A gentleman near the dais saw her first. He was Lord Carstairs, who was 63 and short of sight, and he assumed at the first glance that one of the insurgents had stepped down from the gallery. He opened his mouth to cry out, and then shut it again, because the figure crossing the parquet was not a man at all, but a woman in a half-laced silver bodice and a pair of buff trousers, carrying 8 feet of blued steel as easily as another woman might carry a parasol. His mouth stayed open without sound. The leader on the dais was speaking still. "Lord Bellingham, you will take the pen and you will set down your name where I direct, and when His Majesty hears that—" He did not finish the sentence. Clara had crossed 30 feet of floor in the time he had drawn breath for it, and she had crossed it without hurry, the way a person crosses a room she knows by heart in the dark. The dancers parted before her. They did so without understanding why. A small space opened in front of her, as it opens in a street before a bolting horse, and through that small space she came on, and the halberd came on at her shoulder. The two insurgents flanking Valerius turned. The nearer of them brought his saber up. She did not strike him with the blade. The halberd had a small hook upon its rear edge, just below the axe head, which had been forged in the 15th century for the unhorsing of knights. She used the hook now as it had been intended. A single rising sweep took the man's saber out of his hand and sent it skating across the floor toward Lord Pembroke's slippered foot. The reverse of the same motion brought the butt of the haft round and caught the second man across the breastbone, not hard enough to break a rib, but hard enough to fold him at the waist and send him to one knee. She stepped between them and was past, and Valerius stood free. He stared at his wife. She did not look at him. She had eyes only for the dais. The leader had drawn his own saber. He came down off the step with the spring of a man who has fought before, and he was no fool. He had seen what she had done, and he did not mean to give her the same opportunity. He came at her with the point, low and quick, in a thrust that would have skewered a slower opponent through the thigh. Clara took the thrust on the flat of the halberd, turned it aside with a small twist of the wrist that brought the steel head down across his guard, and tapped him once, very precisely, upon the inside of the elbow with the haft. His arm opened. The saber dropped from a hand that no longer knew how to hold it. He stared at his own fingers in something like astonishment. She brought the butt of the halberd up under his chin, not hard, only enough to lift his head and remind him of where he was, and she set the steel head against the hollow of his throat. Kneel. He knelt. The room had gone so quiet that the candles could be heard guttering in their sconces. Tell your men to set down their blades. He swallowed against the blued steel. You shall not say I. You shall give the order. You have 9 men left armed in this room, and you have lost the room already. Tell them. He told them. The sabers came down one by one, ringing on the parquet. The orchestra leader, who had been crouched behind a music stand with his bow still in his hand, began very slowly to stand up. A dowager near the south wall fainted at last and was eased into a chair by her daughter. Clara did not lower the halberd. She did not turn her head. She spoke across the room without raising her voice, and her voice carried, as a voice carries on a parade ground, every word distinct from 20 yards. Lord Pembroke, be so good as to gather the dropped sabres. Mr. Carstairs, yes, sir, you. The pistol beneath that gentleman's boot. Lift it carefully. Do not put your finger inside the guard. The 2 old peers obeyed her as though she were their colonel. Valerius had not moved. He stood 3 paces from his wife and watched her with an expression his face had never made before. It was not astonishment, though astonishment was in it. It was not pride, though pride was in it also. It was something quieter and far older, the look of a man who has just recognized, in the dark, the outline of a person he has been told for 9 years was dead. Clara. She did not turn her head. Not yet, Your Grace, she said. We are not finished. 2 o'clock in the morning struck from the clock in the orchestra gallery, and the great ballroom no longer looked like a ballroom at all. The chandeliers had been lowered halfway to the floor by Clara's order, and 3 of them quenched, so that the room was lit by a single ring of candles at head height, and the eye could see the corners again. The dais had been turned about and pushed against the southern doors as a second barrier. The dropped sabres had been gathered into a tablecloth and bound and laid at the foot of the orchestra stair, with Lord Carstairs sat upon them in a Chippendale chair, a loaded pistol across his knees, and his snuff-box open in his other hand for steadiness. The 11 insurgents had been disarmed and set against the north wall in a single row, hands upon their heads,
ankles loosely bound with curtain cord. The leader had been moved separately to a small antechamber off the gallery, with 2 of Wellington's young officers at the door. The able-bodied lords of the court, 31 of them, Clara had counted, stood in a double line across the center of the room. They formed a living wall between the disarmed prisoners and the women and elderly who had been gathered behind. The lords held the heaviest things they could lift. Lord Allerton had a fire iron. Lord Pembroke had the ceremonial mace from the dais. A bishop of advanced years, who had served as a young man at Corunna, held a halberd of his own that he had wrested from the second suit of armor with surprising vigor. The ladies and the older guests were gone. Clara had sent them out in 3 quiet waves through the door behind the orchestra gallery, down the service stair, through the back corridor she had mapped on Friday evening, and into the great kitchens, where the cooks had been roused and a kettle set going. The Queen had gone with the second wave, on the Duke of Wellington's arm, and had not made a single objection. Clara stood at a small writing table that had been carried in from the supper room. Upon the table she had laid out, in 3 neat groups, every paper that had been found upon the insurgents: the drafted treaty, a list of names, a hand-drawn plan of the ballroom, marked with the positions of the bolts she had counted on Friday, and the small leather notebook of the kind a junior officer carries upon campaign. She was reading the notebook by candlelight when Valerius came to stand at her shoulder. He had stood at her shoulder twice in his life, once on Tuesday morning in a drawing-room in Mayfair. The second time was now.
Clara, she turned a page. Will you give me a minute, Your Grace? The man's hand is poor, and I should like to be certain of the 3rd name on this list before we send to the gatehouse.
Clara. She closed the notebook. She did not look at him. She looked at the candle. Hartwell, Valerius said, very quietly, so that no one within 10 paces could hear, has spent the past 40 minutes telling me about a rear-guard action at Talavera. He says he served in the next battalion. He says the rifle company at the bridge was held by an officer who would not give the bridge up. 300 French infantry across an open ford, and the rifle company 40 men, and the bridge held for an hour and 20 minutes until the Spanish guns came up. He says the officer of that company was a commander of 7 and 20, with a particular way of putting a man into cover behind a low wall, and a particular way of speaking that an old colonel does not forget. Hartwell says the officer was given up for dead on the road home from Lisbon in the autumn of the year 9. He says the body was never found. Clara set the candle a little to one side so that it did not gutter upon the page. Hartwell talks too much. You are Thorn. She did not answer. You are Commander A. Thorn, whose portrait hangs above the fire at White's, and whom my colonel mourns for as for a son. You have been Thorn since long before you were my wife. You did not pick up the look of things from a blacksmith at Wickham. No, Your Grace. My name is Valerius. You have used it twice in 2 years. You might use it now. She lifted her eyes to him then. They were a clear hazel by candlelight, very steady, and she looked at him as she had not let herself look at him since the morning of their wedding. Valerius. How? My father was a country curate with 3 daughters and no fortune. I was the middle one and the plainest. There was a war on and a need for officers, and a friend of his at the Horse Guards who owed him a debt of conscience. I was 19. The hair was cut, the name was changed, the voice was already low. I served 4 years in the peninsula, and I was good at it, and when the war ended, I was given a choice between a public death and a quiet one. I chose the quiet one. My father had died by then. My eldest sister had married a clergyman in Yorkshire. The youngest was at a school in Bath. None of them ever knew. And our marriage was arranged by the same friend at the Horse Guards. He thought a duchess's gown would hide a soldier better than a parsonage. I agreed because I had nowhere else to go, and because... She stopped. Because they said you were a kind man, Valerius, and it turned out to be true, and every month of the 2 years I have spent at your table has been a small, unbearable theft, because you did not know who you had married, and I had given my word that you never should. He was silent. The candle moved a little in the draught from the kitchen door. You held a bridge for an hour and 20 minutes, he said. Yes, against 300 men. They were not all very brave, and the wall was a good one. He laughed. It was a short, breaking, astonished sound, and it was the first time she had heard him laugh in 2 years. Clara. Valerius. There is still the leader in the antechamber. He will talk now. We must go and let him. The palace library lay along the east front, and at 4 in the morning, the first gray of the dawn was already feeling at the edges of the long curtains. A footman had laid a fresh fire. A pot of strong coffee stood upon the side table. The smell of the books and the smoke and the coffee together was the smell of 100 campaign tents Clara had once known, and she breathed it in as she crossed the threshold and felt her shoulders drop a quarter-inch for the first time since Tuesday morning. 2 of Wellington's young officers brought the leader in. His hands had been unbound at her request. His coat had been straightened. He had been given a cup of water and a chair on the near side of the long mahogany table, and Clara had taken the chair opposite, with the candles between them, and the drafted treaty laid flat upon the wood at her right hand. Valerius stood at the wall behind her, against the bookshelves, with his arms folded. Hartwell was at the door. No one else was in the room. The leader sat down very slowly. His face, by candlelight, was gray and lined, and a small muscle moved at the corner of his jaw. "Your name," she said. "Captain Edmund Reeve, late of the 43rd Foot. Light Division?" "Yes." "You served under Crawford at the COA?" He looked up sharply. "I did." "You were not at Talavera. The 43rd came up after." "No, ma'am, we were not at Talavera." "Then you have not seen me before tonight, Captain Reeve, and you may put aside the notion that you have. We have not met. We have only some friends in common." He passed a hand across his face. The hand shook a little. He set it down upon the table and looked at the treaty between them, and then at his own knuckles, and then at her again. "You are an officer," he said. "I was. I am now a duchess and a private citizen of His Majesty's realm, which is a position I have come to value, and which I should prefer to keep. So let us be brief with one another. I have read your treaty. I have read the list of grievances appended to it. I have read also the notebook in your coat pocket, which I beg your pardon for, but the times required it." "You have read fast, ma'am." "I have read what I needed." She turned the treaty round so that it faced her, though she did not need to look at it again. Article 1 demands the restoration of half pay to all officers broken between the years 12 and 15, regardless of the cause of breaking. That is a just demand and a workable one. Article 2 demands the immediate repeal of the Corn Laws. That is a just demand and an unworkable one, not because it is wrong, but because no king in England can repeal an Act of Parliament with a pen at his throat, and a treaty so signed would be void by Tuesday next, and you would have gained nothing and lost your necks. Article 3 demands amnesty for the men in this room. That is the only article that matters to you tonight, and you have written it last, which tells me a great deal about your honor and very little about your sense. He did not speak. "Your logistics, Captain Reeve, are poor. You came into the palace with 11 men, and you placed none at the gatehouse, none at the stable yard, and none at the river stair. You barred the south doors of the ballroom and forgot the door behind the orchestra gallery, which is how I sent the Queen out at 11 minutes past midnight. You drew sabers of a pattern no palace guard has carried since the year 5, which any man who reads the Gazette could have told you. And you sheared a linchpin on my carriage on Thursday with a file, when a wedge would have served better and left less evidence. That last was clumsy. The man who did it should be retired from such work." "Hawkins," he said, and almost smiled. "I shall tell him." "Tell him with my compliments." The smile died. He looked at the treaty for a long moment. "What do you propose, ma'am?" "This. You will give me, in writing, the names of every man in your association, and you will give them now. In return, I will undertake, upon my word and upon the Duke's, that no man whose only offence is in the writing of this paper shall be hanged for it. The 11 in the ballroom will stand trial for their part in tonight's work, but they will stand trial as English subjects, in an English court, with counsel paid from my own purse, and the grievances appended to your treaty will be laid before the King at his next council by Lord Wellington himself. He has consented. Hartwell will witness. And the men with blood on them. There is no blood on any man here, Captain Reeve. You have finished no one tonight. That is the single piece of good fortune you have had, and you should thank whatever providence you keep for it. Because the difference between a treason trial and a transportation is the difference between a rope and a long road. He sat very still. Why, he said at last, why offer this? We had your husband at the point of a saber. Because I have been a broken officer, Clara said. I know what your men want, Captain Reeve, because I have wanted it. They want to be heard by someone who served. They want a man at a desk to know that the wound at the hip and the wife dead in bed and the farm enclosed in the year 14 are not 3 separate misfortunes, but a single one, and that the Crown owes a debt upon it. They will not be hanged for asking, not while I draw breath in this country. The dawn had reached the window now. The leader looked at her, and then beyond her at the Duke against the bookshelves, and at the older man at the door. He drew out his pencil and asked for paper. By the time the names were written, the first birds had begun in the palace gardens, and the long night was over. Monday evening came down upon Windsor in a soft golden light that made the stone of the palace look honey-colored and forgiving. The damage of Saturday had been put right where it could be put right, and politely covered where it could not. A scorched patch upon the parquet where a candle had fallen had been laid with a Persian rug from the small drawing-room. The barred south doors had been rehung upon new hinges. The suit of armor by the third window stood again in its alcove, though the halberd was no longer in its iron ring. The halberd had been moved, by the King's own order, to a place of honor in the long gallery, with a small brass plate beneath it that had not yet been engraved. The court had been bidden to assemble at 7. They came in their full evening dress, as though for a second ball, though no orchestra had been called to the gallery and no supper had been laid. The room was lit by a single ring of candles at head height, the way Clara had set it on Saturday night, because the King had seen the room so, and had asked that it be kept so for the occasion. He stood now upon the dais. He was a heavy man, and his coat was very fine, and his face by candlelight had the slight softness of a man who has been moved more than once in the past 2 days, and is not used to the sensation. The Queen sat at his right hand, in a chair brought in for the purpose. Wellington stood at his left. Clara had been placed in the centre of the floor, with Valerius at her side. She wore a gown of deep green velvet that the Queen's own dresser had pressed upon her that afternoon, and her hair had been put up plainly, with no feathers and no jewels, save the small string of seed pearls she had worn on Friday. She had asked for it that way. She had said that she did not wish to look like a different woman than the one who had stood in dove grey on Saturday evening. The Queen, who had wept a little in private when Hartwell told her the full of the story, had granted the request without argument. The King cleared his throat. My lords and ladies, we had thought to address you in form, and we have a paper here to that purpose, but we shall set it down. He set the paper down upon the arm of the Queen's chair. On Saturday last, he said, this crown and this realm stood within an hour of an injury from which it would have taken us a generation to recover. We were saved that injury by a single subject, who acted without orders, without rank, without thought for her own person, and against a long habit of silence which she had kept for 9 years out of obedience to a promise made to a now dead friend of ours at the Horse Guards. That promise has been considered by us this morning, and we have considered it discharged. A small movement went through the room. A few of the older men, who had heard things in the past 2 days that had been whispered only in corridors at White's, glanced at one another. A great many of the ladies who had laughed behind their fans on Friday had the grace, this evening, to look at the floor. "Duchess of Ashworth," said the king. "Step forward, if you please." Clara stepped forward. Valerius did not let go of her hand at once. He held it a half-second longer than he had meant to, and then he opened his fingers and let her go. She walked the 6 paces to the dais alone. The king looked down at her. He had practiced several speeches in the course of the afternoon, and he abandoned all of them. "We had thought to give you a riband and a title and call the matter handsomely settled. The Duke of Ashworth has asked us, in private, that we permit him to make the first gift instead. We have consented. Ashworth." Valerius came forward then. He had something in his hand. Clara had not seen him pick it up. It was a wreath of golden laurels, the small ornamental one that had stood since the reign of the last king upon the head of the marble figure of Britannia in the alcove by the dais. He had taken it down himself that afternoon, with the king's permission. In his other hand was his own ducal signet ring, drawn from his own finger. He stood in front of his wife. He spoke loudly enough that the room heard him, but he spoke to her. "On Tuesday last," he said, "I stood in a drawing-room in London and heard 3 young women call you a millstone about my neck. I put my hand upon your shoulder, and I said nothing, because I did not yet know what to say. I know now." He set the wreath upon her hair. It fitted as though it had been measured for her. "For 2 years," he said, "the world has looked into a ballroom for the beauty of an evening, and has measured it in the turn of an ankle and the wit of a couplet, and has found my wife wanting in both. The world was looking in the wrong place. I was married to the bravest heart in England, and the finest mind that has served this crown in my lifetime, and I did not know it, because she had given her word that I should not. She has been called dull and clumsy and a weight upon my name. She is none of those things. She is the beauty of this night, and of any night this kingdom is fortunate enough to keep her." He took her left hand. He drew off her wedding glove, finger by finger, and he set his own signet ring upon her thumb above the wedding band, because no finger of hers was large enough for it. "And from this evening forward," said the king, finding his voice again, "by our pleasure and by the unanimous advice of our council, the Duchess of Ashworth is named advisor to the crown upon matters military and civil, with such precedence and such stipend as the office shall require." Clara curtsied. She did it perfectly, not stiffly, not clumsily, the way a person curtsies who has at last been allowed to stand upright. When she rose, the laurels caught the candlelight, and Valerius was looking at her as a man looks at a thing he has been waiting all his life to see clearly. She put her hand in his. The room began, very quietly at first, to applaud.